You're listening to a broadcast from LOCUS Impact Investing. Hello and welcome to our June feature. Most know us for our national reach as a nonprofit consultant and registered investment advisor helping our foundation partners explore, unlock, and deploy assets for local impact investing. Today, we're going to discuss a unique area of our work. We launched officially when VCC partnered with the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship, and as a result, we have deep experience with rural regions. Rural-facing organizations are presented with unique challenges, which brings us to today's speakers, Deb Markley and Brian Dabson, as they introduce their new project, Regional Solutions for Rural and Urban Challenges. Great to see you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Deb, I guess we can start with you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I am with LOCUS Impact Investing. I'm a senior vice president with LOCUS, and I spend most of my time working in the philanthropic consulting work that we do with foundations across the country. But I co-founded the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship generations ago, it feels like, back in 2001. And spent a lot of time focused on rural economic development, particularly entrepreneurship development. And our other speaker, Brian Dabson, was our first and esteemed board chair and co-conspirator in getting the center founded. So I'm happy to be here and was really happy to have a chance to work with Brian on this project. So Brian, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, Deb. I guess I'm an advisor to LOCUS. I'm still attached to the organization, if somewhat tenuously. And I'm also a research fellow at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the School of Government. I have a focus which is on rural and regional development and governance. And I have, I think of myself as being a sort of pracademic. With too many years' experience in community and economic development policy and practice on both sides of the Atlantic. My experience includes leading the Corporation for Enterprise Development, which was now known as Prosperity Now, the Rural Policy Research Institute, and the Institute for Public Policy at the University of Missouri. All that goes to say is I've been around far too long in this field.
Well, we're definitely glad to have you here today, that's for sure. So I guess with that, we will dive into the Regional Solutions Project. And Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. If I can ask you to speak to kind of the genesis of the project and also some of the broad objectives that we're looking at.
Okay. I think I had the opportunity to sit down with a program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who is beginning a round of funding for projects that would address the idea of healthy communities in a rural context. For many years, I've been arguing that many of the challenges facing rural America must be framed and sort of responded to as regional collaborations between urban and rural areas. So the idea of rural-urban interdependence is a powerful one, which I think encouraged the foundation to support what is a regionally focused project. Our objectives essentially wanted to find out if regional collaboration can be an effective way of improving social and economic opportunity and health for everyone in a region across the rural-urban continuum, and also establish under what conditions regional collaboration would work. I think we saw this as a counterpoint to the urban-rural divide narrative. At least that's how we saw it when we set off. So the project was organized, well, the project took over a year to complete. The heart of it was a series of 7 in-depth case studies in California, the Pacific Northwest, Minnesota, Texas, and North Carolina. And we also held a special meeting in the Mississippi Delta in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, these case studies involved a great many interviews with a broad range of people from public, private, and nonprofit sectors engaged in different ways in regional collaborations. Now, to frame those case studies, we conducted a pretty extensive literature review. We interviewed some 50 experts from around the country, and we went through a very careful process to select the case study sites according to a set of criteria which we developed. So I think we were attempted to develop a pretty rigorous approach to this research project in order to give a really sensible framing to the case studies, and so that we hope we could learn something useful from them.
And then, Deb, if I could turn it over to you, where did LOCUS fit in here?
So our connection was in a couple of different directions. One, I've known and worked with Brian for a long time, and have a depth of expertise in rural development. We also are working in a regional context right now in Central Appalachia with funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And so there was a connection to the same program officer looking, again, the same body of rural work that she's been driving. So we had that connection as well. But I think from a more of a content and mission focus for LOCUS, I think that many of the regional collaborations that we've seen have either funding from or a role for philanthropy. And in some cases, I would argue a really significant role for philanthropy to play in those collaborations. And so it was an opportunity for us not just to bring rural expertise and content, but also to learn from the research as well. So that was the locus, if you will, of benefit for both of us. And I think that's part of why we see this regional solutions work and some of the lessons from it serving a bigger purpose in the work that LOCUS does going forward. And in fact, have already shared some of the material from the project with a foundation that we're working with in California, because they are getting involved in a regional collaborative effort. So that's our role.
And that dovetails really well into the, I think, regional component of this work. So Brian, if I could then turn to you and ask, how should we define a region for the purposes of this work?
Sure. A region essentially is a geographic area. It can be as small as 2 counties, or it can be large, covering several states. They can be formally constituted for political or administrative purposes, such as the Appalachian Regional Commission, or it could be functional, like a school district or a council of governments. A region can also be physical in nature. It could be a river basin or a mountain range. Or it can be cultural, based on the history, the culture, the identity of an area. An example might be the Delta. But often areas can be 2 or more of those. They can be formal, they can be functional, physical, and cultural. And this was certainly the case in the regions we visited.
And Deb mentioned foundations forming regional collaboratives. So when we talk about a regional collaborative approach, what do we mean by that?
Well, this is when governments and business and nonprofits come together across jurisdictions, sectors, functions to try and solve regional problems. These problems might relate to transportation or land use planning or healthcare or economic development, housing, financing, air pollution, you name it, things which topic areas which need to be addressed beyond the confines of formal boundaries and responsibilities. So the collaborative is bringing different interests together across a broad geography to try and solve problems. The collaboratives, as I mentioned, can be formal or informal, but the sense is that they tend to be across sectors and across jurisdictions, working together to solve problems together.
And I'll just jump in here, Chance, that Brian mentioned the sort of screening criteria that we used as we identified the case studies. And one of those was there's wonderful work being done by individual organizations out there. That's not a regional collaborative. It may be really good work, but we really wanted to look at places where organizations were coming together to tackle something together, because that's the magic of a collaborative, is bringing people from outside their normal area of expertise, sort of unusual partnerships.
Right.
That really get at the crux of either a regional opportunity or a challenge. So,
and then when we're talking about bringing groups within a region together, what is it about collaboration within a region that makes it such an effective approach to create solutions and solve problems? I guess I want to bring that to both of you, but I guess I'll turn it over to Brian first.
Let me answer it this way. Most of the big problems that communities face tend not to be contained within their own boundaries, a boundary of a county or a city. It's also true that actions that can be taken in one place can have detrimental impacts on their neighbors. The technical complexity of a particular problem may be beyond the capacity of a government agency. The cost of tackling a problem may be unaffordable for a community working alone. So collaboration means working together to solve problems, share resources, generate fresh ideas. So that's what makes it effective. It adds, I mean, you can say it's 2 + 2 = 5. It's bringing all the different expertise, capacities, resources together in order to solve problems which no individual organization or government can solve on their own.
I think the other thing I'd add, and totally agree about the resource constraints, it's an opportunity to learn together.
Yep.
I think the other thing that regional collaboration does is that it creates a bigger footprint and presence for those regional partners as they try to look to other organizations for resources. So, a regional collaborative around Fresno draws the attention of a foundation like Kresge. An effort in Central Appalachia to create different streams of funding begins to draw the attention of national philanthropy. And so it's a way to really increase the visibility of the innovation and the creative solutions when you're trying to attract additional resources to a place. And I think particularly in a region that includes a lot of rural, those rural places on their own wouldn't be able to attract that kind of attention and visibility.
It's understandable that taking a regional approach can give stakeholders a strong common ground to, converge around. But does this approach present any unique challenges that others don't? And I guess, again, we'll start with Brian.
Okay. Well, the first thing to say, I think, is that collaboration is difficult and can often fail if the right ingredients are not in place. There are always additional costs in working with other organizations and institutions, and it's important that everybody concerned is convinced that the benefits outweigh the costs. Nobody wants to be forced to collaborate with anyone if they think they can do it themselves. So the benefits have to be evident to everybody before going in. There are also, and we saw this in our casework, there are issues of power and resource imbalances. Say, for instance, in situations where large, well-resourced cities are working with small, poorly resourced rural counties. One side has all the money and the technical capacity, the other doesn't, and that makes collaboration hard. It's also likely in many places that decades of competition or political differences makes it hard for the parties to trust each other. There may be limited experience of governments and businesses and foundations working together. So, and probably most importantly, there may not be strong regional leadership that is adequate to bring people to the table. So I think basically what we're saying is that this is hard work. But I think the evidence suggests that if done correctly, the benefits are enormous that accrue to the region and to the organizations concerned.
I'll add just two things to that. There is an extra cost of collaboration, and it needs to be covered. It's going to take extra staff time, and that's not something that most folks have built into their budgets. And so you're going to need additional resources. And again, once you start putting money on the table, that you need to have that really strong trust so that everybody feels like they're going to get a fair shake with it. But I think the other thing is that everybody that's part of a collaboration has a full-time job doing something else within their organization. And having somebody, some organization, some individual that's holding the collaboration, that is the hub of this collaborative effort, that wakes up every morning wondering how they can advance the collaboration itself, is a really critical piece of this. And it looks different in every collaboration, but you've got to have somebody who is spending a significant amount of time on the collaboration itself and not just have it be the added thing that they do at the end of the day for a couple of hours after they've done their full-time work. So I think those are the other two things I'd add.
And also, like you said, Deb, each collaboration is unique, which provides us with a good segue into the case studies that we looked at themselves. So, Brian, if you could describe for us one of a collaboration that sticks out to you in your mind, and give us kind of a summary of that.
Yeah. Perhaps if you'd allow me, I'd just like to preface that by just giving you a sense of the 7 case studies more generally, because they're all very different, and they represent different pieces of what it is we're trying to put across. I think I'll go into detail about one of them, which is in Sacramento, California, around what they call the rural-urban connection strategy. But let me just give you a quick thumbnail of each of the others. In the Pacific Northwest, we looked at 2. One was called Craft 3, which is a regional community development financial institution, a CDFI, which has had a deliberate strategy over many years in investing equally in rural and urban places. And the whole thing is structured in such a way that it has substantial presence through offices in both rural and urban Washington and Oregon. And it's been extremely effective in putting money in places where it's most needed. The other one in the Pacific Northwest is Sustainable Northwest, which is a nonprofit which has been focusing on particularly community development within the forests, the public forests in the region, as a response initially to major conflict between jobs and environment at the time of the spotted owl, which is 20 odd years ago now. But it's all about building collaboratives in different places, bringing all people together to solve problems around forestry and community development, particularly in rural Oregon, but also in Washington. Over in Minnesota, this was an example for us of a huge regional ecosystem approach. It's rooted in decisions made many years by philanthropy in setting up regional foundations, in government with a series of regional development commissions, plus all sorts of mechanisms for bringing these together on a regular basis to look at how they can build up rural and regional interventions, build the economy, build healthcare and childcare and all these things to support rural development in the state beyond the confines of the large Twin Cities metropolitan area. If we move down to North Carolina, we look specifically there at a regional commission called the Land of Sky, which is a council of governments. And we were particularly interested there in their attempts to bring broadband into a mountainous rural area and how they use collaboration in order to make that work. In Texas, the Amarillo Community Foundation, which works in the Texas Panhandle, this worked with 26 counties, I think, across a huge rural landscape there. We went to visit them primarily because they were in their very early stages of building a regional collaboration, particularly around business investment in rural communities in the region. Where else? Oh, then we end up in California. The one that we did in California was concerned with a partnership for the San Joaquin Valley, a large area in the Central Valley of the state, which felt that, and with some justification, that it had been largely ignored and undervalued by the richer parts of the state on the coast. And this was a big collaborative of a variety of interests, from the university to local governments to private sector, to try and deal with really major economic and environmental challenges that were facing a community, and actually to build in a very intentional way responses that would address issues of social inequity, racial inequity, and what have you in the region. So then we go back to Sacramento now, which was an initiative run by the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. This was created many years ago as a consortium of 6 counties and over 20 cities to really act as a forum for discussion and study of area-wide issues such as transportation, water and air quality, land use, housing, and so on. Other parties involved in this were the state of California through some of their very large agencies, the University of California at Davis, and a range of farmers and growers, as well ultimately with the Chamber, the Economic Council for the region, and a number of nonprofits. So what they were about in terms of this particular initiative is that the Council of Governments had gone through a fairly major exercise, which they called a blueprint for the economy of the region. And when they completed it, they found that they knew an awful lot about the city and the urban areas, but the rural areas that form the outside Sacramento, they knew nothing about it. It was undifferentiated as far as they're concerned. It was like a green area beyond the urban fringe. And they realized that that was not a good way to proceed, and a lot of the more rural counties were unhappy about that focus. So they developed something called the Rural Urban Connection Strategy, or RUCS. And this was two things. One, it was a strategy to look at the region's growth and development from a rural perspective, a really intentional rural perspective. And the other was a sort of suite of data and analytical tools for proactive planning and forecasting, looking at scenarios for the impacts of development on air, water, and the rural economy. This has proved to be a really interesting project in many ways. It's received national attention, partly because of the data and analytical side. But I think the critical point here is that there was not much interest from the city in what was going on in the rural areas. And not a lot of money went into this program, but eventually through 10 years of hard work, we've got to a situation now where the region recognizes that agriculture and food processing is the region's primary economic generator. It puts $1 billion plus into the regional economy every year. And it's elevated Sacramento to being the farm and fork capital of the area, bringing in 100,000 visitors a year to their festival. So the RUCs, the whole analytical framework, the looking at it from a rural perspective and bringing public, private, non-profit entities all together started to shift priorities from just thinking about transportation as a means of moving commuters around, but how do you move goods around and out of the region? How do you think about farmland conversion to urban development? And how do we manage water supply and quality, both to serve both rural and urban areas? So I think this is a rather interesting specific idea of raising the profile of rural communities and rural interests through a regional collaborative framework.
And Chance, if I can jump in, I know one of the questions is how do people take this kind of work and do something with it? And I think that Brian just laid it out in some ways, I think, so beautifully. I just want to feed off of that. The idea of doing some kind of analysis that creates this just common understanding of what is true in a region, that just leads with data that helps people sort of get beyond their preconceived notions of what's going on in an economy and what's driving a regional economy, and really build that common understanding, that common analysis, if you will, that gets everybody on the same page.
Right.
And I think it is one of those things that can bring people together. I think that the second piece of it that Brian laid out so well in that story is just some organization that's going to bring the stakeholders together across those different sectors is just so incredibly important. And I would add a bias toward, I think that foundations, place-based foundations, often can play that role because they don't necessarily have a dog in the hunt.
Right.
They're not an economic development agency. They're not a social service agency. They often have the capacity to be a neutral convener in this way. So I just thought as you were describing that, Brian, it really laid out, I think, the two most important first steps for an organization that's trying to, or a set of organizations that are trying to take a more regional collaborative approach to this.
Mm-hmm.
And to follow up on that collaboration, kind of where are they now?
In Sacramento, the business community is now fully on board in recognizing the importance of agriculture and food processing to their region. They hired the Brookings Institution to come in and look at what are the economic generators for the future. And lo and behold, they merely confirmed the fact that what RUCs had shown them was that this is really important, and that the future of the region and the urban areas in particular was inextricably linked with the health and well-being of the rural communities and rural businesses around them. And I think that's a really important lesson, which hopefully will carry forward into the future, and actually so that the rural areas don't have to fight so hard for every dollar that's spent outside of the city. Everybody can see that it's all part of supporting the total region and its economy and its people going forward.
So, with that, and in terms of the project itself, Brian, what can regional stakeholders do with this research specifically? So, how can people looking at this apply it to their own situation?
Perhaps the best way to do this is to think about what our research showed in what makes effective regional collaboration. I think Deb has already started to talk very well about what I think is number one, and that is having an institution, a regional focused institution, which can be the convener and be the leader, if you like, and is trusted in the region. I mean, we talked about the fact that such an institution or an organization has to have deep roots in the community, has to have a real solid understanding of what's been going on and why things are the way they are, and a strong analytical capacity, so that, as Deb said, you can actually distinguish what's real and what's not. And I think the beauty of a regional approach is that it is going to differ from region to region as who steps into that role. So I think one of the lessons is that it could be a regional foundation, and it has been in some of the ones that we looked at, but it could be a council of governments, it could be a CDFI, it could be a university or a community college. It could be whoever has that trust and those roots and contextual understanding, which I think is the first thing. So the right person needs to step up. The second is, and this came out, I think, from the Sacramento case study, but I think it applied to most of them, is that we have to understand, or we go into this with an understanding that both urban and rural people and communities and business contribute to regional well-being. Well, everybody contributes to regional well-being. So when we pull together collaboratives, it means not just reaching out to the usual suspects, the chamber and all the others that always step up when there's something big to promote. But we need to actively engage diverse stakeholders across the rural-urban divide, if you like. So I think that's pretty critical in reaching out and establishing a level playing field for people to be able to participate in this sort of venture. One of the things that was really important from the way we were looking at this, and I know it was very critical for the foundation who funded this work, is that we really have to be intentional about addressing inequities, whether it's geography, race and ethnicity, gender, income, class, so that we can improve social and economic opportunity and health for everyone. Many of these challenges are deeply embedded in history and culture of the region and require really determined efforts and realigned priorities to achieve change. So intentionality is something that's a critical part of this, and without it, we're not going to get very far on that particular metric of regional success. I mentioned in Minnesota that they were an example of establishing regional ecosystems. And I think this is something that everybody should be paying attention to. When we're looking at some of these challenges, whether we're looking at affordable housing, childcare, healthcare, workforce, transportation, broadband, these tend to be sort of separately looked at, and each of these issues has its own systems, they're policy advocates, they're service delivery agencies, funding sources, political constituencies. But in fact, these are all very much interdependent issues. And at a regional level, we have to find a way of connecting all these different systems and resources together into what I think we've called, which I think rightly called regional ecosystems, so that we can recognize and work through these interdependencies. And I think the final thing I would say, and Deb, I hope you've got some others to add to this, is that this is long-term. This is not something that you can do, okay, we'll put 2 years funding into this and see what happens. As we've already said, that regional collaboration is hard, it's slow, and it's expensive. But if we're going to benefit from all that, we need long-term funding and commitments to make it work. So there have to be incentives in place to overcome some of these challenges that we've identified, to incentivize collaboration in different ways across sectors. So lots of people have to step up to invest for the long term in regional collaboration. So those are some of the things, the main lessons I think we drew. But Deb, what else? What have I missed?
I think you did a great job summarizing that, Brian. I just want to contextualize this for just a minute, because we are doing this recording on May 28th,
Yes.
2020, 10 weeks, 12 weeks into a crisis that has sort of laid bare the fact that no county, no community is an island. And I think that if anything, the crisis that is gripping the country right now has put the regional interdependency, the fragility of supply chains between rural and urban, just has put it front and center. And so I think that while this was not in no way, shape, or form did we think about this as we were doing this regional solutions project. But I think there are lessons embedded in it about how one addresses something that doesn't recognize traditional political and geographic boundaries, and how you deal with something that's at a magnitude where it impacts all aspects of life. That the fact that a child care center is closed now might mean that you don't have a doctor in a hospital in the midst of a pandemic. So I just think that, again, I think it was a good body of work, and I think that there are lessons to be had from it in this really challenging time that we're facing right now.
So speaking of the work, Deb, where can people go to find out more about it?
So we have built, much to your credit, Chance, we have built a webpage on the LOCUS website. So if you go to locusimpactinvesting.org, under what we do, we have a rural page, and you will see the regional solutions work there. You'll also find an email address for Brian, because we do recognize that we didn't look at every regional collaborative that exists in the United States. And so we're really open to having folks reach out and tell us about some of the work that they're doing or respond to the research. The research is organized, and the page is organized so that if you're an academic and want to think about this from a research perspective, there are particular pieces that might be most useful to you versus a practitioner versus someone that might be a policymaker. So we encourage you to go there and to let us hear from you as well.
With that, thank you both so much for joining with me today. To follow up on Deb's point, we'll be including links to this material where we've posted this. And if people would like to hear more from LOCUS and our work, I'll also include a sign up to our newsletter there. And also think about connecting with us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and social media at LOCUS Impact. And once again, thank you both, and thanks to everyone who tuned in.
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you, Chance.